This one day after explosive testimony on Capitol Hill, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, the man overseeing the special counsel investigation into Russian meddling, is at risk of impeachment. And the president's hand-picked director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, describes his new job as, quote, staring down the barrel of a contempt citation. And brand new reporting from the New York Times out in the last 30 minutes sheds new light on Rosenstein's private anger over being used to rationalize the firing of FBI Director James Comey. The Times reporting that in public, Mr. Rosenstein has shown no hint that he had second thoughts about that role. But privately, quote, he expressed remorse at the tumult it unleashed, said the White House had manipulated him, fumed over how the media had portrayed the events, and said the full story would vindicate him. According to one person with whom he spoke shortly after Comey's firing, Rosenstein was shaken, unsteady, and overwhelmed. Another person in touch with Rosenstein around that time said he sounded frantic, nervous, upset, and emotionally dysregulated. In one of these conversations with the acting FBI director at the time, Andrew McCabe, Rosenstein became visibly upset. Joining us now from the New York Times, Mike Schmidt, who just broke this story, NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Delanian, and Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI assistant director for counterintelligence. I'm glad we had planned to talk to all three of you today. Mike Schmidt, take us through what you're reporting about previously unknown and very emotional reaction from the Deputy Attorney General.
This was this incredibly important time. It's between the Comey firing and when Mueller is appointed. It's a little more than a week. And what was going on in Rosenstein's head? And he was very, very concerned about how he had been used by the White House as the person to explain the firing. They had used this memo that he had written about Comey's handling of the Clinton email investigation as the basis for the firing, what they put out to explain it. And he thought that that was wrong and that he was the fall guy, the scapegoat for this. He had only been the Deputy Attorney General for 2 weeks. Now, from Trump's point of view, what he doesn't understand is that why is it that Rosenstein played along with the Comey firing, wrote the memo, but then went ahead and appointed Mueller to investigate that actual incident? What is it that changed in that period of time? And that's why we think it's important.
I want to read a little more from the story, which just posted 15 minutes ago. So you guys are reporting that Rosenstein's meetings show his mindset at one of the most critical points in Mr. Trump's administration, the 8 days between when Mr. Comey was fired and Mr. Rosenstein appointed Robert Mueller as special counsel. In that stretch, Rosenstein went from a supporting actor in the dismissal of Mr. Comey to the official overseeing the investigation in which the firing was a focus. You guys also write that Rosenstein is both the ultimate supervisor of that case and will determine what information is eventually provided to Congress and a key participant in the matter being investigated. Mr. Trump's lawyers also regard him as one of the essential witnesses for the president's defense because Mr. Rosenstein, they say, wanted to get rid of Comey. You touched on this, but just detail how complicated it is to be Rod Rosenstein. We're going to get to yesterday's fiery testimony. I talked to a senior Justice Department official today who said they welcome the opportunity to show how even-keeled the Deputy Attorney General is. But your reporting certainly doesn't describe that side of him, and his role is extremely fraught with peril from all political directions.
Well, it's so conflicted, and as he is the chief or a very important witness in the Comey firing, he's also dealing with this issue on Capitol Hill, where he has these Republicans that are going after them. He's trying to buy them off, trying to give them this information on an ongoing investigation, a highly unusual thing, to try and give Mueller more time to do what he's going to do. It is a very, very interesting spot for him, and it's all because Jeff Sessions recused himself. That is the original thing that gets us to where we are. Sessions stepping aside, allowing Rosenstein, and the president obsessing over that decision. The president very upset that that Sessions had recused himself. He doesn't trust Rosenstein, and he blames the special counsel on both of them.
Let me read some of that reporting from the piece. On the afternoon that Mr. Mueller's appointment was announced, Mr. Sessions was in the Oval Office with the president discussing candidates to be FBI director. When they both learned that Mr. Rosenstein had made his decision, Mr. Trump erupted in anger, saying he needed someone overseeing the investigation who would be loyal to him. Mr. Sessions offered to resign. You also report that Rosenstein had every right to be furious over the way this all went down for him, and a source close to Rosenstein says the White House put Greyhound tire tracks on his back. They threw him under the bus. Lots of hurt feelings to go around.
Yeah, I mean, the original problem here is that the president wanted to send his own 4-page letter to Comey about why he should be fired. And the White House counsel, Don McGahn, looked at that letter and said, this is not a good idea. The president had mentioned the fact that Comey said he wasn't under investigation in Russia, but the letter was rambling. It went on and on. It sort of read like one of the president's, stump speeches. So what happens is that McGahn brings in Sessions and Rosenstein, who were already interested in getting rid of Comey, and they use Sessions and Rosenstein as the rationale for the Comey firing, as the explanation for it. And people find it funny because Donald Trump's essentially saying Jim Comey was too mean to Hillary Clinton.
And Frank Figliuzzi, there is some extraordinary irony in sort of the layers of Rod Rosenstein being peeled back the day after such brutal attacks from members of his own party. Rosenstein, a lifelong Republican, under blistering attacks from Republicans in the House Judiciary Committee. When it turns out he wasn't ever comfortable being the fall guy for the president's decision to fire Jim Comey.
Yeah, so yesterday was quite a disgrace to watch, and most Americans should just be very troubled by the blatant personal attacks on both the FBI Director Chris Wray, appointed by President Trump, and the Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, a Republican, brought in with Trump. And yet what we're seeing, Nicole, is essentially a slow-motion train collision about to occur between the Republicans in Congress who are hell-bent on finding a way to get Rosenstein out and stop the special counsel investigation, and the DOJ train, and these two trains are about to collide. Sitting squarely on the tracks is the special counsel. So what's happening here is time is being bought by DOJ and FBI to allow Mueller to finish his job. But what I'm telling you is going to happen sometime in the next 30 to 60 days is that collision is going to really come very close. And what's going to happen is that the Republicans on the Hill are going to start demanding the names of informants and undercover agents. We saw a hint of that yesterday. At some point, DOJ and FBI are going to have to say no. Lives could be lost. We'll never have to be able to recruit another source again. We can't disclose this to you, and the collision's going to occur.
And Frank, what do you make of this new reporting about Rosenstein becoming uncomfortable with the way the White House was using? I remember that day. I remember being on the air when we learned that Comey had been fired, and I remember watching Kellyanne Conway reading from, I think it was a 4-page memo, reading from it on the North Lawn as she did interviews, and wondering, I don't know if that's the whole story. I mean, to learn that he's been uncomfortable with the White House posture toward the department in some aspects, and Mike's reporting takes us through some discomfort with McCabe and learning about the Comey memos as well. But to learn that the White House gave him pause that early in the administration certainly ties the thread to yesterday in a more clear way.
So what we're seeing in Rosenstein is a man, as many public servants similar to him have experienced, which is you go by the letter of the law and you make certain assumptions that our system works when all three branches are acting, and all the actors in them are acting as honest brokers, right? That's the premise of your public service career. So Rosenstein drafts that memo recommending the departure of Comey, but he does so based on solid facts. Look, the IG even said Comey went out of bounds, right? His judgment was poor. And Rosenstein does that. Within minutes or even days of this happening, he realizes, I'm not dealing with an honest broker in the White House. else. There's a political agenda here, and I'm being used, and that's what we've seen happen.
And that's the story of so many people who come into contact with this White House. Ken Delaney, I want to get your thoughts on Mike Schmidt's new reporting, and then I want to get all of you on the news we learned today about Mike Flynn's sentencing. So, Ken, start us off.
I think it's fascinating that we're hearing this story now, Nicole, and I think it suggests the extent to which Rod Rosenstein has had it. He's at the end of his rope. I mean, recall that our colleague Julia Ainsley reported back in April that he was having late-night phone calls with friends and seemed resigned to the idea that he would be fired, and essentially quoted Martin Luther saying, "Here I stand." You know, and this reporting is further evidence, the fact that folks are willing to disclose this. And it's not surprising. I remember at the time just talking with Pete Williams about how Rosenstein's appointment of Mueller was, in a sense, his way of trying to get some of his reputation back after being so badly used in the Comey firing. And now we're seeing sort of the details of that. But it's absolutely clear that he is at the end of his rope, and yesterday's hearing was just the latest example of that.
And Ken Delaney, let me get you to switch topics for us. And I know you've got some thoughts about the significance of the delay in the sentencing of Mike Flynn, who pleaded guilty and is a cooperating witness, as one former prosecutor told me at the time. He's on Team America now.
Right. I mean, we have to be careful about reading too much into this, as Frank well knows. But the fact that they are continuing to delay Mike Flynn's sentence, Mike Flynn is cooperating with Robert Mueller's investigation, suggests that he still has a lot more to give them. And you can contrast that with George Papadopoulos, another Trump campaign aide who pleaded guilty and was nominally cooperating. His sentencing has been scheduled for September. So they're sort of done with him, it appears, at this point. But Flynn may have a lot more to say. And interestingly, you know, these stories cross because Devin Nunes sent a letter to the FBI demanding all evidence of contacts between FBI informants and undercover agents and a list of Trump campaign officials. And on that list was Mike Flynn. So apparently Devin Nunes thinks that Mike Flynn was at some point talking to an FBI informant, Nicole.
So, Frank Figliuzzi, can you lay over those two things that Ken just detailed, the delay in sentencing of Mike Flynn and the idea and the notion that the Department of Justice and the FBI are dealing with ongoing requests for an unprecedented, it would appear, level of detail about an ongoing investigation?
Yeah, so first, a couple of thoughts on the Flynn sentencing being delayed. First, look, I think what's apparent here is that the president may well intend to pardon Flynn. And if you sentence him, the pardon could come down very, very quickly. If you draw this out, it's unlikely the president's going to do a pre-sentencing pardon. So that's one aspect of it. The second is there's a hint here that Flynn's not fully cooperated or done yet, and they want to keep this hanging over his head. So that's that. My theory on that. With regard to the demands, unprecedented demands during a pending investigation for details on informants, sources, undercover agents, we've got to see this for what it is. It is nothing more than a blatant attempt to get Rosenstein and or Chris Wray to say, no, we can't do it, and then they'll be held in contempt, or there'll be impeachment proceedings against them, and will literally face Trump appointees being held in contempt by a Republican Congress in an attempt to protect Trump. And
Mike Schmidt, let me bring you back to the point about pardons that Frank just raised, which I hadn't thought of in the news today about delaying Mike Flynn's sentencing, but you've reported on the president's former lawyer, John Dowd, dangling the prospect of pardons before both Paul Manafort and Mike Flynn. So there is a pardon history already with Mr. Flynn.
And pardons are in the questions that Mueller wants to ask Trump about. He wants to ask what Trump knew about this. Did Trump have surrogates reaching out to Flynn to raise this prospect with him? There had been reporting last year by Yahoo News that Flynn had this call with the president in which the president said for him to stay strong, or the president was trying to send a message to him in that sense. So there are sort of larger questions on the pardon issue there, and this, as Frank points out, sort of delays this. But I guess on the sentencing with Mueller, it just reminds us of the probably most unsatisfying part of all this is that there's just so much we don't know. We really don't know why Mueller delayed it, you know, why he continues to hold this over Flynn, and we continue to be surprised by what goes on. And I realize that's not That's not the easiest thing for everyone to get their head around, but that's sort of where things are.
Frank, you and I feel, talk most days about all of the known unknowns around the Mueller probe. This seems like another one, but if you could, again, try to tie these two stories together, the idea that Rosenstein, from the very beginning of the Trump presidency, so unnerved, I mean, basically describes someone deeply rattled and emotional by what they were asked to do in service of this president. And Mike Flynn, someone who was dangled or offered or maybe flirted with the idea of a pardon, now with his sentencing delayed. There's just sort of a commonality running through everyone that comes in contact with this White House, and it seems to have some sort of either ignorance of the rule of law or disdain for it or effort or desire to go around it, doesn't it?
Well, and what we see, Nicole, is that certain people who have some semblance of normalcy and justice and rule of law end up departing the White House. And that's what's happening. And with Rosenstein, we have a different situation. He's not part of the White House. And as he said yesterday a couple of times, I have a duty here. I have an obligation here. So we've got a man who must be just restlessly trying to sleep at night, figuring out, how do I fulfill my duty as Deputy Attorney General of the United States, overseeing an unprecedented special counsel investigation, still try to ensure that the president and the GOP is happy enough to allow us to get our job done, yet not give it all up and start divulging things that should never be divulged in the middle of a case. I feel for him. I empathize with him. And we've all got to just call our members of Congress and say, look, Mueller, Rosenstein need protection. We need a bill to protect them. We need to allow this to finish.
Mike, let me give you the last word on the last line of your story. You report that this month Mr. Rosenstein hinted at his inner turmoil during a speech in Philadelphia, quoting the city's favorite fictional son, Rocky, saying, quote, "It ain't how hard you hit," he said, "it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." He added that advice applies in boxing, in law, and in life, and that is certainly his experience at this hour.
Yeah, and the question hanging over Rosenstein is, what will the president do about him? The president doesn't think he has the political capital to go ahead and fire him. The president's afraid of that. He has scar tissue left over from the Comey firing, and I think he's afraid of what the Senate would do if he went forward with that. The question is the president waiting until after the midterms, or does he think that Rod Rosenstein is just someone he can never get rid of? And we'll have to see until later this year for that to play out.
And Bob Mueller wants to know the answer to all of those questions, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and the questions that Bob Mueller has for the president. I mean, still this large thing hanging out there. Will the president sit down and talk to Bob Mueller and answer the questions that he wants him to?
Mike Schmidt, thank you for your reporting. Thanks for sharing it with us. When we come back, more on the war on justice and those explosive charges from congressional Republicans and how Rosenstein is pushing back. Also ahead, inside the quiet campaign to guarantee Donald Trump a second Supreme Court vacancy. Exclusive new reporting from the New York Times. And did an infamous radio prankster just trick the President of the United States aboard Air Force One? We'll play you that audio and let you decide. That's coming up.
Well, certainly when I was minding my own business in private practice in Atlanta, I didn't think I was going to be spending the first 10 months of my job staring down the barrel of a contempt citation for conduct that occurred long before I even thought about being FBI director. Having said that, I am committed to making sure that we're responsive to these committees.
A hot war between congressional Republicans and the Justice Department escalating a day after the president's congressional fixers turned up the heat on Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and FBI Director Christopher Wray. A senior Justice Department official telling me today that Rosenstein's testimony on Capitol Hill, quote, speaks for itself, and adds that the contentious nature of the relationship is only on one side, theirs. It's worth noting that the Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee are many of the same members who spent 2.5 years investigating Benghazi and turned up 0 indictments and 0 guilty pleas. Now, they're attacking a lifelong Republican who appointed a former director of the FBI, also a lifelong Republican, to oversee an investigation into Russian meddling that has yielded 16 indictments. and 5 guilty pleas in 13 months. Armed with animus, debunked conspiracy theories, and Fox News-inspired rants, House Republicans made their disdain for Rosenstein clear.
It's really the Rosenstein investigation. You appointed Mueller. You're supervising Mueller. Seems like you should be recused from this more so than Jeff Sessions.
Whatever you got, finish it the hell up.
I want to know why you won't give us what we've asked for.
Sir, I certainly hope that your colleagues are not under that impression. That is not accurate, sir. And
it is accurate. We have caught you hiding
Mr. Chairman, if you have evidence of wrongdoing by any member of the Trump campaign, present it to the damn grand jury.
My job is to make sure that we respond to your concerns. We have, sir. Now, I've appointed Mr. Lausch, who is managing that production. And my understanding is it's actually going very well, sir. So I appreciate your concerns.
Again, I think the House of Representatives is going to say otherwise.
But your use of this to attack me personally.
Why did you? It's not
wrong.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. May the witness be permitted to answer the question?
It's not personal,
Mr. Jordan.
It's redacted.
I am the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Okay? I'm not the person doing the redacting. I'm responsible for responding to your concerns as I have. I have a team with me, sir. It's just a fraction of the team that's doing this work, and whenever you brought issues to my attention, I have taken appropriate steps to remedy them. So your statement that I'm personally keeping information from you, trying to conceal information...
You're the boss, Mr. Rosenstein.
That's correct. And my job is to make sure that we respond to your concerns. We have, sir.
Thank God he's the boss. The senior Justice Department official I spoke to today also noted that even the resolution demanding documents that passed, the documents being requested by these members have either already been delivered or the request is in the process of being accommodated, leaving this official to question the public nature of yesterday's display. Joining us at the table, Rick Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and former Time Magazine managing editor, Evan McMullen, former CIA operative who ran for president as an independent, and the Rev Al Sharpton, president of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC. Frank and Ken are still with us. Ken Delaney, and let me come straight to you. You've got an extraordinary piece out today detailing what they are asking for. And I'll ask you what I asked Frank in the last block. The nature of what they're looking for is incredibly detailed, confidential information about an ongoing investigation. Is there any precedent for what they're asking for? And is there any sense that they'll stop at any point? The Justice Department insists that they're accommodating these requests, and that what makes them so extraordinary is the fact that they all get out to the media. They're all in the press.
I fear, Nicole, that the news-consuming public is not understanding just how extraordinary and remarkable this is. They see a bunch of Congress people yelling at executive branch officials. They see a fight over documents. This is not a normal oversight fight. This is the Republicans in the House of Representatives demanding, and in most cases receiving, the kind of internal and secret documents about a pending criminal investigation that have never before been turned over to Congress, or rarely, if ever. For example, FBI 302s, the detailed notes that FBI agents take of interviews. Now, there's one precedent for that. James Comey turned some of those over in the Clinton investigation to the last Congress, but until recently, that had never happened. Secret FISA applications. Zoe Lofgren, a Democrat from California, said yesterday that she's been around for 24 years. She's never seen anything like this kind of information turned over to Congress, and she said she spent most of the day reading the Carter Page FISA application, and she said there was such sensitive information in there that lives could be lost if it was made public. And the fear is that these Republicans are using this material in a very cavalier way. And while you heard, Rosenstein being attacked by Republicans, which is remarkable in its own right, and you may have heard some Democrats trying to interject on his behalf, some people, including our friend Matt Miller, have been arguing that Democrats should actually be asking harder questions of Rosenstein. Principally, why are you handing this stuff over to these people? Why are you breaking with precedent? And one of the answers, I'm told, is that he's being advised by other members of the cabinet that, look, at the end of the day, President Trump is not going to back you guys on this. You can take a stand and refuse to hand it over, but it's not really up to you. It's his executive branch. And House Speaker Paul Ryan has also been siding with these firebrand conservatives and putting pressure on the Justice Department. So it's a really... We're in uncharted territory here, Nicole.
And Frank, that's such a good point that Ken makes. I mean, these men are on an island. the president, the commander-in-chief, has no regard for the rule of law, has no affinity for any of the individuals running the Department of Justice, seems to have, I'm told, no personal connection to the head of the FBI, which doesn't matter except for that he hasn't taken his side in very public disputes with Devin Nunes, with whom he does have a warm personal relationship. Where does this leave us when the Department of Justice and the FBI is untethered from Congress? They really don't have a lot of support in the Republican-led Senate or House, untethered from the White House, and they're hoping that they can buy enough time, accommodate the request, is the word that I keep hearing from Department of Justice officials, to let either Mueller finish his job or to stay in these jobs, lest the president appoint someone who doesn't adhere to the rule of law.
A couple of thoughts. First is, thankfully, Rosenstein and Wray know a whole lot more about when Mueller's going to finish up than Congress or the White House knows. And they know the timing, and they can play that timing to their advantage. So they may know, in coordination with Mueller, just when they're able to say, no more, this ends now, because Mueller's then coming in with his findings, number one. Number two, I'm really concerned about the long-term damage. Well beyond this, we are now setting precedent that impacts national security. We're setting a precedent where if Congress demands names of informants and sources and undercover agents and what, where, and when, and putting lives in danger and the ability to recruit long-term deep sources, because you can no longer look them in the face as FBI agents do in their careers and say, I need you to betray your country for our country. I need you to come over to our side. And that informant looks at you and says, can you guarantee my safety and my anonymity? And now you say, maybe not. That's the long-term damage here.
You gave me chills and you made Evan nod. Evan?
Yeah, well, Frank's absolutely right. And I'll tell you, even if the identities of sources that are contributing to the investigation never come out, the fact that the members of the House, these Republicans, are going after their identities, trying to expose them, has a chilling effect on their activities, on the ability of the investigation to gather information from these sources anyway. So it doesn't even matter if the House is successful in getting those identities. It's already threatened. It already threatens to have an impact. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but I would imagine it is, because I've seen situations like this where our ability to protect sources sort of comes into question because somebody's revealed for one reason or another, and we end up having a harder time collecting information in investigations.
We could put up the obliteration of norms that the president has steamrolled over behind us on a wall and make a big fancy graphic, but this seems like one in which lives could be lost, yes, and American national security could be in peril.
Yes, I mean, and also the irony, I'm old enough to remember when the Republican Party was the law and order party. You now have House Republicans.
Isn't that Donald Trump's convention speech?
I think before that. But I mean, long before, I mean, the party was the supporter of the Justice Department, the supporter of the FBI. Democrats were accused of being weak on that. The other thing that people are not talking about, which you alluded to in a subtle way before, is that as soon as the Justice Department hands over this document, the staff in the House committee will look at it and decide what goes immediately to the Washington Post, what immediately goes to the New York Times. That jeopardizes the security of people, and because Rosenstein knows that as soon as he gives it over,
it goes to Fox News. I mean, let's say what they're really worried about.
Right.
They're worried about the disinformation campaign. They're worried about the pipeline between what they turn over to these House members and ends up in a graphic called Mueller's Mob Family on Fox News.
Right.
They're not worried. I didn't hear any concern about what the Washington Post does with information that comes up through their public affairs office. I think they're concerned, and I think the reason Rosenstein was so assertive on the Hill yesterday, and the reason you see them finally sort of getting their side of this story out, is that they understand that Fox News and the president's allies in Congress have done some damage. I want to know if you think, Rev, that it's, you know, the president calling in these code reds.
I think it's clearly him calling it in, and he's the one to benefit. And I think that they've not only got to worry about them leaking it to Fox News, they have to think about he may be the one they would give it to, and he is the one they're investigating. Have you ever heard of someone under investigation sending their boys out to tell me what they got, and tell them to cut off the investigation. I think we need to take a step back. Yeah, absolutely, Al Capone. We need to take a step back here. They are actually saying, as elected members of the Senate, that we don't care if there was a Russian interference. Chop it up, end it. I mean, they ought to be the ones more than anyone saying, are you telling me the patriotic law and order party that we may have been interfered with? The fact that they're outraged with the investigation more than...
And not the Russians.
Not the Russians makes one wonder what is really going on here.
It's not. I know you don't wonder. You got a theory.
No, I think it's very clear. I think the president is like other leaders who Vladimir Putin supports. I don't think the president would likely have won the election had it not been for Russian interference. That's our situation. We're not the only country to be in this situation. But let me just say this. There's a lot of people who are increasingly saying that, look, this investigation, the Mueller part of it has been going on for a year. It ought to wrap up. I really want to push back on that. This is the type of if this were a counterintelligence investigation of just one person, it would last probably longer than a year. We're in a situation now where every time you turn over a stone, it's another several Russians or Americans dealing with Russians or more contacts. This is a complicated situation, and anyone who says that this should be wrapped up within a year or even 2 years has no idea what they're talking about. There's a lot to look at here.
And you do.
But why are we even defending it? Have you ever heard of people under an investigation saying, okay, let me tell you when it ends?
Yeah, right.
I mean, why are we even acting like this is rational?
Right. Well, we're not. Others are.
Right.
Not here. Not here. Not around this table. Ken Delaney, thank you for spending so much time with us. We're grateful to have you.
Great to be with you.
When we come back, can a sitting president be indicted? That question may end up before the Supreme Court, and it's adding fuel to the fight over the president's next pick for the highest court in the land.
In just a moment, Justice Gorsuch will be sworn in by Justice Kennedy, a great man of outstanding accomplishment. Throughout his nearly 30 years on the Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy has been praised by all for his dedicated and dignified service. We owe him an enormous debt of gratitude, and I am honored that he is with us today.
It was just a blip on the seemingly odd but secretly deliberate things Donald Trump says at public events. The president going out of his way to praise the court's swing vote, Justice Anthony Kennedy, who many of his own supporters despised, even vilified, for his rulings on abortion, gay rights, and the death penalty. But perhaps there's a reason for everything. That may have been part of a larger plan. The New York Times reporting today, quote, in subtle and not so subtle ways, the White House waged a quiet campaign to ensure that Mr. Trump had a second opportunity in his administration's first 18 months to fulfill one of his most important campaign promises to his conservative followers, that he would change the complexion and direction of the Supreme Court. Frank and the panel are still here. Pretty maniacal, and suggests that at least one office in the West Wing is functioning, and that would be Don McGahn's office of the White House counsel.
Well, and also, the president is a con man, and unfortunately, Justice Kennedy was conned by him.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea that Trump actually has any desire to appoint a justice who has an open mind like Anthony Kennedy does is absurd. And the fact that Kennedy believed it is just credulous in a way that a Supreme Court justice shouldn't be.
Let me read through, I mean, you talk about the campaign, and I mean, it was sleazy. So let me read from Vanity Fair. Trump had to demonstrate to Kennedy that he could be trusted to nominate quality jurists to the Supreme Court. The campaign was multifaceted. Over the course of several months, Trump systematically nominated 3 of Kennedy's former clerks for plum judicial posts. While he criticized other, more conservative members of the court, he lavished praise on Kennedy, despite the fact that the justice has been pilloried by the right for his votes on social issues. And he cultivated a relationship with Justice Kennedy's son, Justin, who works closely with the Trump organization in his role at Deutsche Bank as the global head of real estate capital markets. You could not make up the intersections between Trump's businesses and Trump's picks on, of all places, the Supreme Court.
No, you couldn't. And, you know, I think during the campaign, Trump learned that he had a very powerful bargaining chip and that he would put an originalist on the court if he were only elected. You know, many Republicans at that time weren't crazy about Trump, but they knew if they would only elect him, they could get someone to continue the Scalia-era balance of the court. This will be more powerful, by the way, because this isn't continuing the Scalia-era balance of the court. This is changing the balance of the court. And it's at a time when the president increasingly needs the Senate and increasingly needs the court, and he's going to be able to make an even more compelling case to his base, which is already more aligned with him than he was even able to do with Gorsuch.
And Frank, it may be an understatement to say he needs the court. I mean, the court could end up, I mean, I've been told that if Bob Mueller has made a decision as to whether or not he can or will indict the president, he wouldn't have told anyone. So we don't know that he's made that determination, but that's the kind of decision in the Russia investigation that could potentially end up in front of the Supreme Court.
Right. I mean, let's play this out. So the president's under investigation. The investigation may well lead to a grand jury subpoena of the president or an indictment of the president. Both of those scenarios would lead quickly to the Supreme Court and be challenged by the president. And the president's about to pick one of the people who will help decide that matter. That's what we're looking at right now. And trying to view this through the eyes of Mueller, we now have two time factors that must be present in his mind. First was always the midterm elections. When do I come out with my findings? Do I bifurcate this? Maybe do obstruction first before the elections, maybe do Russian collusion after. Now here's a second time factor, which is a new Supreme Court justice could actually play into the success of Mueller's investigation, and that's got to be foremost in his mind right now.
And let me come back to the campaign to influence Kennedy's decision-making and ask you about something else reported in the New York Times about Justice Kennedy's son. The younger Mr. Kennedy spent more than a decade at Deutsche Bank, eventually rising to become the bank's global head of real estate capital markets, and he worked closely with Mr. Trump when he was a real estate developer, according to two people. During Kennedy's tenure, Deutsche Bank became Mr. Trump's most important lender, dispensing well over $1 billion in loans to him for the renovation and construction of skyscrapers in New York and Chicago at a time other banks were wary of doing business with him. And let me play you Trump talking to Justice Kennedy about his son. You couldn't make this up.
That's very nice. Coming from you. You can say hello to your boy. Special guy. Your kids are great. They love him, and they love him in New York. Right.
Special guy who loaned me $1 billion.
No, I think when I was reading the Times story early this morning, when you take the connection of the son, the appointment of the clerk, certainly he did the New York con on Justice Kennedy. There's no question about it. And I think the timing, a lot of people said, well, he wanted to do it so he could appoint someone before the midterm elections. No, it's about the Mueller investigation.
No doubt.
Because it goes to the Supreme Court at whatever stage. So you've got a guy now that has his guys in the Senate saying, give us the evidence or stop this, and you're going to stack the judges now that's going to decide. I mean, he couldn't have dreamed this up if Roy Cohn was still advising.
Answer this question for me. How can you, so his friends will say privately, and some of them publicly, that he's too incompetent to have colluded with Russia, but he's so good that he lured two guys off the Supreme Court.
Lured two guys off the Supreme Court.
One died, just one.
And these will be the guys that will determine his legal fate. And in the balance is Roe versus Wade, affirmative action, all of that. That he can go to his base and say, yes, I may do all of the things that you evangelicals have been preaching against, but look at what I've given you. And he can survive to destroy another day. And this is scary as it gets.
Frank, you're leaving us after this block, so I'm going to give you the last word. Too incompetent to collude with Russia, but he can lure Anthony Kennedy off the Supreme Court. Doesn't add up.
So look, I've looked at many criminals, career criminals, organized crime figures. Then none of them were too incompetent to commit crimes and be corrupt. That's my last word.
That's a good one. Frank Figliuzzi, thank you so much. We ask you to come on at the top. You get stuck here for 43 minutes, and we're grateful. Still ahead, was President Trump the subject of an embarrassing prank? The White House won't say, but an infamous prankster claims he got the commander-in-chief. We'll play you the audio and let you decide. That's next.
when we break news.
We have breaking news on the president's legal battle.
We're merely breaking the surface of the story.
President Trump's former campaign chairman locked up.
Because beyond those two words,
we're getting a first look at images provided by the federal government of girls who have been separated from their parents.
Is where the details lie.
President Trump and Kim Jong-un making history.
Where the facts are buried. And the only way to uncover the whole story.
We have news just breaking tonight.
Is to dig deeper than...
Yes, this is Edwin Menendez. Is the president available? Yep, 1 moment, sir. I'll connect your call. Sir, your call is connected. Hi, Bob. Hey, how are you? How are you? Congratulations on everything. We're proud of you. Congratulations. Great job. You went through a tough situation, and I don't think a very fair situation, but congratulations.
That was an interesting behind-the-curtain look at how the President of the United States receives calls when he's on board Air Force One, made more interesting by the fact that that wasn't Senator Bob Menendez on the phone. It was actually a prank call to what sounds an awful lot like the real Donald Trump, courtesy of the Stuttering John podcast. The host got through 2 call screens, even reportedly Jared Kushner. And as Axios points out, quote, this calls into question White House security. White House staff members are freaking out today trying to figure out how the podcast host was so easily transferred from the White House switchboard to Air Force One, per a source familiar with the call. NBC's Hallie Jackson joins us from the White House. Hallie, I know from my time in the White House that the protocol for a conversation between the President of the United States and a member of Congress is to go through the head of Leg Affairs. Any talk about a broken or non-existent process at this White House today?
Not formally, Nicole. No comment officially from the White House. But in this instance, normally that would not be interesting, right? A no comment from White House officials. In this instance, it is, because if that was not the president, or if this was not an issue, because that wasn't actually the president, you would be hearing about it. There would be pushback saying, well, this was fake. This is a edited or faux podcast or whatever. That is not the reaction that we have heard from West Wing officials today. So a couple of points to point out here. Number one, you are right, because you know this. There is a procedure and protocol that goes into place. Now, for this president, I will say he speaks with members of Congress all the time without going through the Director of Legislative Affairs or through that office. He has a direct line to certain members of Congress. Bob Menendez probably not, right? Or at least that's not the indication, given that he was able to be connected through the switchboard. But it's not always the procedures and protocols are followed for those phone calls with this president because of his relationships on the Hill. That said, there are security questions that have already been raised about how a prankster got through, apparently to the president, on a phone line to Air Force One. Second piece of it is what else is in the call. So let's say this is Donald Trump. And again, the White House is not confirming that. They are not saying it's not. They're not saying anything about it. But if it is, later on in the conversation, this podcast guy, this former Howard Stern sidekick, asked the president about the Supreme Court pick, and the president talks about the timeline of it. He says, yeah, I want to name a Supreme Court pick sometime in the next 2 weeks, Nicole, which jives with what our reporting has been and syncs up with what I've heard from White House officials, which is the working assumption is the president is likely or would want to try to name a Supreme Court pick before he heads out to NATO on which starts on July 11th. So we are looking at the next 2 weeks here. And this is Stuttering John, who apparently is getting this information from the president, if it is the president, via this prank phone call. I would also note one other thing. Interesting start to the conversation, too. The president sort of congratulating him, and then right after that, talking about how it was it seemed to be an unfair investigation that Menendez was under. So lots to unpack in what was this, 5-minute crank call, apparently, to the president on Air Force One.
Rick, it is remarkable that forevermore, or at least until the president says something to another news outlet, we're going to have to credit the Stuttering John podcast for our most recent insight, as Hallie just reported, into the president's thinking on the timing for a Supreme Court rollout.
Well, Nicole, as a long-time Howard Stern listener,
I'm a Howard Stern listener fan.
I can't
good on him.
I can't tell you how disappointed I am in Stuttering John. He asked the questions Chuck Todd would have asked him. Stuttering John was on Howard Stern.
What did you want to know?
Well, I'm not even going to go there.
Yeah, go there. Come on, you raised it. Where would you go? Where should Stuttering John?
Well, think about the things that Trump used to say on Howard Stern.
Hallie's covering her eyes.
Okay.
No, I can't.
Wait. Serious question. This does epitomize the intersection of Donald Trump's loony world, which the Rev is nodding, knows all too well. Like, I bet if he just said who he was. Hey, this is Stuttering John from how. I'm not sure that the president wouldn't have been just as eager to pick up the phone.
He might have got the call through. If he had said who he was, he might have got the call through anyway. I mean, the guy picks up the phone, the president of the United States, and congratulates a senator for getting out of trouble. That's his opening now.
Right.
And doesn't, like, what can I help you with? All of this that we would think a head of state would be concerned with someone from the opposing party. Hey, we're proud of you. And then goes on talking about the timeline for a Supreme Court justice. The reason, first of all, I've talked to Donald Trump on the phone. It does sound like Donald Trump.
Yes, it does.
Secondly, when you look at the fact that how would Stuttering John have called the White House? Why would he even call the White House and then get through the Air Force One and lie about it? It wasn't that he would call another number. He would know they would hang him by his shoes if he didn't call the White House. So why would he put himself in that kind of legal...
You have talked to Stuttering John.
No, I've talked to unstuttering Donald Trump.
The Rev always knows all the players. All right, Holly Jackson, thank you so much for bringing us this interesting story, White House story. I'm not sure there's ever been a live shot from that spot on this particular story in the history of White Houses. I'll check, though. We're going to sneak in a break. We'll be right back.